What if I told you a murderer left his own blood at the crime scene? Police collected it. They knew it belonged to the killer. They held the evidence in their hands. And yet, for the next 26 years, they still couldn't identify him. Not because he disappeared, not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because the technology to expose him didn't exist yet. So while detectives waited, the killer went back to work, built a life, celebrated birthdays, spent holidays with his family, completely convinced he had gotten away with murder forever. Then, one ordinary day, a single discarded item changed everything. The evidence he thought had been forgotten finally spoke, and what happened next shocked everyone involved. This is the unbelievable true story of how one tiny mistake at a dark country gate came back nearly 3 decades later to sentence a killer to life in prison. Kindly tell us in the comments section where you're watching from, and if you're new here, hit subscribe. It gets you notified anytime we cover any shocking case. Here is the real question in this story. What happens when a killer gets away with it? Not because he was clever, but because science just wasn't ready yet. In 1994, this killer left his own blood behind. Investigators knew it. They held it in their hands. They just could not read it. DNA testing back then needed big, clean samples. What they had was small, damaged, mixed with the victim's blood. So the science said, not yet. For 26 years, the truth sat quietly in a box, waiting. This is a story about patience. A family waited 3 decades for one word, guilty, and a killer built a whole new life. He believed the past was buried, but a lab tech, a phone call, and 7 police agencies were closing in. He never saw it coming. Here is how it happened. To understand this case, you need to understand James Harris. He was not a man with enemies. He was not in any danger. He was steady, quiet, reliable. He lived at 1610 Boss Road, a quiet corner of Walker County, Georgia, the kind of place where a scream might not reach anyone. He worked at a factory in Ooltewah, Tennessee, just across the state line. That commute mattered. It meant he left home before sunrise, every single day. Anyone who worked beside him would know his schedule, his gait, his road. He had a son, James Richard Harris, Jr. He had a wider family, too, the kind that gathers every December for the holidays. For 28 years after his death, those holidays came and went. An empty chair. No answers. Picture the house. Small, warm light in the windows. A truck parked out front. A man pulling on his coat in the dark. Same as 1,000 mornings before. Routine is comfort. But routine is also a blueprint. Someone had studied that blueprint. Someone knew exactly when he would walk to that gate. Alone. In the dark. Every single day. This whole mystery began with something small. A man's morning schedule. And on December 22nd, 1994, someone used it against him. Somewhere between 5 and 7 that morning, Harris walked toward his gate. This was not a break-in. Nobody entered his home. This was an ambush. Staged at the one spot where he was most exposed, his own gate. The attacker struck him first in the back of the head. Then came strangulation, hard enough to leave deep injuries on his neck. Personal items were taken from his body during the attack. Investigators later read this as the motive. Robbery. Blood pooled on the ground near the gate. Blood on the fence posts, too. This was not quick. This was not clean. There had been a struggle, a real fight for survival, in the cold, in the dark. At around 9 a.m., a neighbor found him. Walker County deputies arrived. They knew right away what they were looking at. A homicide. They called in state investigators for help. And here, the case should have moved fast. They had a body, a crime scene, evidence. including blood-stained jeans, and one small, easy-to-miss object near where he fell, a single, bloody tissue. It told them something important. The killer had bled too. Somewhere in that struggle, he got cut or scratched. He bled onto that tissue, and he dropped it. He left a piece of himself behind, without ever knowing it. But knowing a killer bled at the scene, and knowing his name. Those were two very different problems in 1994. This part explains everything that follows. This case did not go cold because investigators were careless. It went cold because of timing. In 1994, DNA testing needed large, clean blood samples. What investigators had was the opposite: small stains, damaged samples, blood mixed with blood. The tools of the time could not pull out a clear match. Investigators knew a stranger's blood was sitting in their evidence room. They just had no way to turn that blood into a face. Then there was the silence of the road itself. Boss Road was rural. The attack happened before daylight, at a private gate, on a stretch with almost no traffic. Nobody saw a car. Nobody saw a person. The same quiet that made this property peaceful most days. That is exactly what made it the perfect place to kill a man. But the deepest failure here was not science, it was geography. Harris lived in Georgia. He worked in Tennessee. Back then, that state line acted almost like a wall. Investigators searched the neighborhood. They talked to people on Boss Road. But they never fully checked every coworker across the state line. That single gap mattered. A man who knew Harris's schedule was never even interviewed. By 1996, every local lead had dried up. Neighbor interviews went nowhere. The evidence sat in storage, rich with clues, but unreadable with the tools of the time. The file went cold. For the Harris family, this meant something brutal. The man who killed their father might still be alive. He might still be working nearby, and nobody could touch him. Cold cases do not stay cold because people stop caring. They stay cold because the leads run out. All that is left is to wait. Wait for the science to get better. That wait ended in 2005, more than a decade after the murder. State investigators reviewed old Walker County cold cases. Harris's file came back out of storage, the blood-stained jeans, the bloody tissue from the gate. Both were sent back to the lab, this time for a newer, more accurate DNA test. The results confirmed what investigators suspected for 11 years. A single male DNA profile, pulled cleanly from both the genes and the tissue. This was not Harris's blood. This was the killer's blood. Left behind during the fight at the gate, preserved almost perfectly for over a decade. For the first time, they had his genetic fingerprint. But a DNA profile only helps if you can compare it. They checked it against regional databases. They checked early suspects from the 1990s. Every single comparison came back negative. So the case reached a strange, cruel point. Investigators now had the exact genetic identity of a killer. What they still did not have was his name. The bloodstain had started talking. It just had not said whose blood it was. Yet. 4 years later, in 2009, the case turned again. This time, the break did not come from a lab. It came from a phone. A tip came into Crime Stoppers. The caller did not give a last name, no address, no hard evidence, just one word, a first name, Allen. On its own, that is almost nothing. But investigators had an unmatched DNA profile for 4 years. Even a small clue like this was worth chasing. Detectives went back to Harris's old workplace, the one lead nobody had fully explored in 1994. They pulled personnel records from December of that year. They cross-checked every employee name against that one word, Allen. That search led them to a name, Robert Allen Mowry. Mowry worked at the same factory at the same time as Harris. He was never interviewed back in 1994, a direct result of that gap across the state line. Then investigators pulled his time card from that morning. He was late for his shift, unexcused, out of character for him, and the timing lined up almost exactly with the murder. Just miles away, across the state line. For the first time in 15 years, they had a real name. But a late time card and a first name were not enough. They had a suspect. They did not have his DNA. This is the most painful part of the whole case, not because nothing was happening, but because investigators were almost certain who did this, and they still could not act. Naming Mowry as a suspect was not the same as proving it. A late clock-in and an anonymous tip were not enough. Not enough for a warrant. Without his DNA directly, there was no legal way to confirm the match, and without that, there was no way to arrest him. So the case entered a quiet holding pattern. Mowry, meanwhile, lived an ordinary life. He lived in Tennessee, first in Tullahoma, later in Nashville. He was not hiding. He was not on the run. He simply existed, year after year. Just on the other side of a line investigators could not cross yet. Between 2009 and 2020, detectives kept quiet watch, waiting for the moment belief could become proof. Think about that gap for a second. 11 years. A man works, eats dinner, celebrates his own holidays. While 2 states away, a small team never stopped watching. That moment would not come from a confession. It would not come from a slip of the tongue. It would come from something Mowry would leave behind, without ever knowing it, just like he did at that gate, 26 years earlier. In 2020, this quiet case became a full task force effort. This was no longer one detective working alone. It was 6 separate agencies, across 2 states. One shared goal. The plan was simple to describe, hard to carry out. Watch Robert Allen Mowry in Tennessee. Recover a sample of his DNA without him knowing. Something ordinary. Something thrown away. Something that would carry his DNA without his consent. Picture it. A man going about a normal day, completely unaware he is being watched, waiting for him to throw something away. The operation worked. Investigators secured a hidden sample. They sent it straight to the crime lab for direct comparison to the profile from 2005. The profile pulled from Harris's genes and that single bloody tissue. The result came back. A direct, confirmed DNA match. 26 years after he left blood behind at that gate, that same evidence finally identified him. On September 4, 2020, at 10 p.m., agents made their move. They arrested Robert Allen Mowry in Nashville. He was 50 years old. He had been 24 at the time of the murder, a young coworker who knew Harris's schedule by heart. He simply went home and kept living. He built an entire adult life across the decades, all while a piece of tissue paper waited in a locker, waiting for science to catch up to him. An arrest closes one chapter. It does not deliver justice on its own. For that, a jury had to hear the evidence. Robert Allen Mowry was formally charged in Walker County. The case number was 2-2CR-025. The grand jury charged him with 4 felony counts: malice murder, felony murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Pretrial motions stretched all the way through November of 2022, more than 2 years after his arrest. The trial finally began in late November of 2023. Over 7 trial days, prosecutors built their case, almost entirely on science and paper records. Lab experts explained exactly how the DNA match was made. Former coworkers took the stand. Neighbors from Boss Road described that morning in 1994. Officers explained how one word on a tip line led to an arrest. The defense argued not guilty through the entire trial, but against a direct DNA match. There was very little room left to argue coincidence. On Wednesday, December 6, 2023, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of felony murder. The judge did not delay. Mowry was sentenced immediately, life in prison, 29 years after Harris walked to his gate for the last time. This case was finally closed. Here is why this case matters beyond one road, one gate. According to national crime data, roughly 340,000 homicide cases went unsolved in America between 1965 and 2021. 340,000. Each one may have its own version of that bloody tissue, sitting quietly somewhere, waiting for science to catch up. Notice what this case was not. It was not solved with fancy family tree DNA search tools, the kind behind other famous cold case breakthroughs. This case was solved the old way: a preserved sample, a direct lab comparison, one word from a stranger on a phone, a time card that placed one man in the wrong spot. The real lesson here is simple. Evidence, protected patiently, can still speak years later, even when it feels useless in the moment. Sometimes the right move is not forcing an answer today. It is protecting the truth, long enough for the tools to catch up. For this community, that is exactly what happened. Cold cases are never truly closed, only paused. James Harris left his house before sunrise on December 22, 1994. He expected nothing more than an ordinary day at work. Instead, his death became one of the region's longest unsolved cases, until a piece of tissue paper and 26 years of patience spoke his killer's name. If cases like this keep you up at night, hit subscribe. There is another cold case coming next.